The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharon Dooley, and I'm the moderator for today's session. I think you're going to find this topic very interesting. Disaster recovery is not just about technology. And I know myself, it's very easy to get sucked up in the technology aspects and forget all the rest of the world out there. I just want to say a little bit about our sponsor, Dell Software, who has sponsored us for several years now and who makes it possible for us to have a raffle giveaway for every session. SQL Saturday, if you don't know about SQL Saturday, it's time to learn about it. It's a free one-day training event, and as you can see from the ones that are coming up, they're all over the world. And I know in the Philadelphia one, we usually have 6 tracks and 5 sessions in each track. So you've got a full day's worth of free training. And I urge you to check it out. We are one of many virtual chapters, and you can see all the ones that exist. If you're not on a mailing list for one that you're interested in, you can modify your past profile at sequelpass.org. I haven't found out yet what Saturday Night SQL is. That sounds kind of interesting. I have to learn about that one. I urge you also to find out if there's a local chapter in your area. These are face-to-face networking events. I know in the Philadelphia one meets, there's always pizza and soda and at least one technical presentation and sometimes a marketing presentation by the sponsor. If there's not one in your neighborhood, start one. PASS will help you. Contact CE at sequelpass.org for information about how to start one. PASS is an all-volunteer organization. Yes, there are paid staff in the headquarters, but the group is driven by volunteers as an elected peer board, and each month there's an outstanding volunteer award, and you get to nominate people for that. So the email for sending your nominations is on the slide. And I'm assuming you're all members of PASS, but if you're not, join. It's free to belong, and it's a valuable source of training information. Now, I'm pleased to introduce Edwin Sarmiento. He's a Microsoft certified master and MVP from Ottawa, and he has a lot of experience in disaster recovery and high availability. And his goal is to help everybody grow and develop their full potential. And now I'm going to, as soon as I manage to get PowerPoint to go away, turn the meeting over to Edwin and let him do his thing. Okay, it's all yours.
Thanks, Sharon. Let me show my screen. Hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yep.
Perfect. Wonderful. Hopefully you can also hear my audio real well. Thanks a lot. And I'm really excited. This is my very first presentation of the year. Usually the last quarter of the year is the busiest, and Sharon has already mentioned about the wonderful learning opportunities that you have in terms of participating in the global PASS community. In fact, I have Sharon to thank for back in 2007 was my very first PASS Summit. I've attended one of her sessions at the PASS Summit, and I was really encouraged that after that I started volunteering. And a couple of years after, here I am. Today's topic is something that I'm really passionate about. I've been doing high availability and disaster recovery since I think about 2005, 2006. It's about 10 years now. I've been working with a lot of different technologies. In fact, I kind of consider my key area of expertise is on SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery. So we talk about clustering availability groups, database mirroring, anything that you can think of in terms of high availability and disaster recovery end to end. That's what I love doing. If you have any questions, I would so recommend and so encourage you to type your questions on the chat window on the GoToWebinar panel. So you should see on the right side of your screen a chat window. Type in your questions. We'll be happy to answer those questions probably at the end, because I'm going to be covering a lot of concepts. And just to set the expectations right, there are no demos for this particular presentation. I blog, I think twice a week on my blog. I write about high availability disaster recovery, SQL Server, and anything in between, but primarily focused on high availability and disaster recovery. You can also send me an email if you have questions, or feel free to share insights about what you learned from this session on Twitter. And let's just get started. I'd like to start this presentation by telling you a story. When I was a kid, I was just so playful that I actually spent a lot of time on construction sites. In fact, one of our family friends is an architect and a construction engineer, and I spent quite a bit of time playing in construction site. In fact, I have a nasty scar below my right eye, and that is because when I was 5 years old, I accidentally hit one of their equipments. Kind of a nice story to start with, but basically at an early age, I was introduced to the world of construction and how a lot of people work together to start building construction and buildings, houses, and stuff like that. And I also had an opportunity to talk to people involved, whether they're the artisans, the foreman, the engineer, the architect. I had a chance to interact and just talk to them, ask questions. It's kind of an exciting opportunity for me as a kid, of course, and you get to play around. Of course, it's from where I come from, there is no such thing as safety when it comes to that, but again, it's a learning experience, and it's also interesting how you start seeing how the project evolves from an open site with nothing on it, and then you start seeing machineries, the backhoes, the equipment's coming in, start doing all the work, slowly laying the foundation, and so on, until a couple of months after you see a nice, beautiful house or a tall building that you've never imagined it would look like when it was started. And it's also kind of interesting because, you know, I kind of noticed that if they need to get the job done faster and quicker, they're going to bring in more people. They're going to bring in more equipment. They're going to put more resources into it. And I started thinking, well, is this really how it is? That in order for us to get the job done faster, quicker, we need to bring in more people, get more advanced tools, more equipments, and all of that. And this got me thinking, well, maybe it is true that the better tools get the job and get the work done a bit faster, more efficient, fast. And that's how I started thinking about the building that gets constructed. And what I kind of didn't realize is there's really a lot that gets into, or it goes into building or coming up with construction and building something. For example, the architect has to be there, the foreman, the structural engineer, the mechanical engineers, if it's a big building with heating, ventilation, air conditioning, you need to get the people, the people responsible in order to get the job done. You also need to get a permit. Well, come to think of it, even though you have a lot of money, a lot of resources, even though you got everything that you need, if you don't have a building permit, well, you can't really start building, can you? And on top of that, of course, you need to have a blueprint. I mean, it's the blueprint that dictates how a building gets built or how a structure gets built. And every section of the building or the structure will have its own blueprint. Like you got a perspective view on how the entire structure would look like once it's finished, and then you've got a mechanical blueprint if you're putting in elevators within the building, or again, the heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems, the electrical blueprint, and so on and so on. And I kind of like to think of disaster recovery and high availability as well, but because our topic is primarily on disaster recovery, as something similar to the construction industry. And they're really not no difference in terms of how we want to look at disaster recovery or high availability and the construction industry. Let's start off with some of the definitions. Let's take a very simple definition and look at what disaster recovery is and its definition. I've grabbed this from Wikipedia because it's the first one that you get when you do a quick Google or Bing search on what this particular phrase means. And I want you to take a look at 3 key words in the definition: process, policies, and procedures. And come to think of it, the definition here says it is the process, policies, and procedures related to preparing for recovery or continuation of technology infrastructure. But then there's nothing in here that tells you, oh, you got to look at maybe using clustering for your database, or maybe using availability groups for you. There's nothing in here that talks about, hey, you need to do backups. Nothing. The definition in of itself starts with having the process, policies, and procedures to meet a specific objective. Unfortunately, when you start, well, and I was guilty of this myself when I was starting off as a SQL Server professional, because what you see and what you will hear when you bring people together, when you bring IT professionals, project managers, business stakeholders, when we start looking at how do we design a disaster recovery solution, or what disaster recovery solution do we need for a specific IT asset? Yeah, well, you kind of, as a SQL Server professional, you kind of see these phrases, you know. People start throwing in log shipping or availability groups or backups or clustering. All of these are features. SQL Server features, to be specific. We kind of get lost in the details of, yeah, let's use clustering, let's use availability groups. And why is that? Why the focus on the features when dealing with disaster recovery? Well, for one, because the focus has always been on technology. And besides, we're IT professionals. We'd like to get our hands dirty. We want to try out new features. We want to implement something. We want something done. And so we're kind of inclined to do the things that matter to us. Technology. And that's why when you ask a SQL Server professional, hey, what disaster recovery solution should I implement? In fact, it's something that I've noticed, and I've been answering questions on the MSDN and TechNet forums since the early 2000s. And when somebody asks a question about what feature am I supposed to use? Do I use failover clustering? Do I use availability groups? The focus has always been on technology. And throughout my career, in fact, for the past 10 years, when I started getting involved with disaster recovery and high availability, I came up with what I call the framework for building, designing, and establishing a good disaster recovery solution. I call it the PPT Manifesto, and of course I just use the PowerPoint icon there just to give you a quick hint of what this is. And these letters stand for three key principles. The first one is process. You have to have a properly defined process to make sure that every or any disaster recovery solution that you implement will follow a specific process. Take, for instance, I want to provide a disaster recovery solution for a database infrastructure that is 24/7. How would you provide a solution for that if in the first place you don't have a process in place? The process will define how people would behave, how the business would respond, and what technology to use. I already mentioned the second P, people. You need to have a cohesive team. It doesn't really matter if you're a rockstar DBA. It doesn't really matter if you can restore a terabyte-sized database in under an hour. Unfortunately, the database or any database does not exist in isolation. Your application has to go through the network. Application has to connect to the database. The database has to sit in a server connected probably on a storage area network. And a lot of these parts or a lot of these components require people who understand how these components work in order to make everything work. And I kind of tell SQL Server professionals, look, don't get caught up with just looking at the database. Think of the entire spectrum, the entire architecture end to end, where you're looking at the end user sitting on her computer, accessing the application through a browser or a thin client or anything you can think of that connects to the database, going through the network, and so on and so on. You need to have the right team to make sure whatever solutions you put in place is manageable. When you've identified the right process and the right people, that's the time you decide what technology that you need to use. Use that framework when you start thinking about what disaster recovery solution am I supposed to implement for a specific project. And because this whole session really focuses on the non-technology or non-technical aspects of disaster recovery, I want to dive into other non-technical aspects that you would hear people talk about, especially project managers, when you start embarking on a disaster recovery project, or even high availability projects, because these concepts apply to both high availability and disaster recovery. I kind of think of this in terms of like the alphabet soup of HADR. In fact, I've written a blog post about the alphabet soup. They're not just three-letter acronyms. These are things that need to drive your choice of a high availability or a disaster recovery solution. Let's start off with the most common one. And the way I frame these concepts is I frame them in terms of how we respond to these questions. The first one is business impact, or what's commonly referred to as the business impact analysis. Now, you can find a lot of definitions out there about this particular requirement. Basically, the way I define it is by answering the question, what are the risks of losing a specific process in the business? And I have a specific pet peeve in terms of architecture and infrastructure in an IT organization when everything is treated the same. I don't like everything being treated the same. You know, it's just like me being a kid with all my siblings are all being treated, because they're not the same. Let me give you an example. An e-commerce site that's running 24/7 and that's generating revenue for the company is nowhere, it's not the same as an internal HR system. Because an e-commerce system that's generating revenue for the company should be considered more mission critical than an HR system. Well, if your company is only operating between normal business hours in North America, then between 8 in the morning Eastern Time to 5 in the afternoon Pacific Time, compare that with the impacts of losing an e-commerce system for 4 hours. You got to answer the question, if I'm building a disaster recovery solution for System X, what's the impact of losing System X in terms of the overall business? That's business impact analysis. The second one is one of what I call recovery objectives. One of two recovery objectives. And this recovery objective is called the recovery point objective, or the RPO. One word statement is recoverability. And it answers the question, how much data can I afford to lose? In most cases, as data professionals or IT professionals in general, when you think of recoverability, you think of it in terms of backups. And I want to explain that in more detail because it goes beyond backups. I want to show you a screenshot of schedules on a database maintenance plan where you got a full database backup running every day and a log backup running every 15 minutes. Of course, if your database is in simple recovery model, log backups don't really matter. But let's say this is something that you configure as a standard across all of your SQL Server databases. Let me highlight that for a moment. And the reason I'm highlighting this is I want you to pay attention to how you would look at this screenshot once we're done with some of the concepts that we talked about. And by the way, just be sure that you check your backups today and make sure that they're not just completed successfully, but also validated that they're working as expected. Now, recovery objectives are basically or typically measured in terms of time intervals. And let's use numbers in this case. Let's say you have a recovery objective of, or recovery point objective of 12 hours. Let's assume that something happened 10 o'clock today. And today, of course, is the 13th of January. Something happened at 10 o'clock. And of course, if something happened at 10 o'clock in the morning, you wouldn't be here. You'd probably be working towards resolving that particular issue. But if you have a 12-hour recovery point objective, it means that you have, or you can afford up to 12 hours of data loss, which means once you manage to recover your system or your database as SQL Server professionals, it means that you should be able to recover your database as of 12th of January 2016, 10 p.m. at most. That's a recovery point objective. And it's important for us to think of both recovery objectives and business impact analysis, because your recovery objective definition will be dependent on the business impact. And that business impact, of course, will depend on how the business stakeholders define what the business impact is for a particular IT asset. It's not just a matter of when the last successful or when the last backup occurred. I already said successful. It's really a matter of asking the question when the last successful backup occurred. And this is not just looking at your SQL Server agent jobs and reviewing that all the jobs completed successfully, because you might be surprised, just because a backup job completed successfully doesn't mean you have a good working backup. It's one of the reasons why I don't trust successful backups. What I do trust is a successful restore of a good working backup. Because backups are, again, backups are totally useless unless proven otherwise, is how I'd like to phrase it. The third item is availability. And it's the second recovery objective of the two recovery objectives that I mentioned. And this one refers to recovery time objective. So the first one's recovery point, and this one's recovery time. It basically answers the question, when is my application coming back? And it goes beyond simply dealing with hardware or system failures. It really it goes beyond that, because as I mentioned earlier, databases do not live in isolation. I mean, let me repeat what I mentioned earlier. It doesn't really matter if you're a rockstar DBA who managed to recover your database in less than the time that your recovery objectives require. If the application can't connect to it, technically the database is offline. I mean, how many times have you seen when you refresh Amazon's page and the page does not respond? It really doesn't matter if it's a network issue, an application issue, or a database issue. From your point of view or from the user's point of view, it's technically offline. And this is where, again, you start looking at not just the database, but the overall architecture and the overall system in general. And let's use examples like what we did in the previous example. Let's say you got a recovery time objective of 12 hours, again, for simplicity's sake, 12 hours. Let's use the same date and time for an outage, say. 13th of January, 10 o'clock in the morning. You have until 10 p.m. tonight to bring the system, and I'm not just talking about the database, I'm talking about the system, to make sure that you meet your recovery time objective. These two things alone, your recovery objective, the recovery time and recovery point objective, should give you some ideas on how do you want to implement a disaster recovery solution to make sure that you are indeed meeting your recovery objectives. Again, by just simply showing numbers and giving you some ideas about, this is my recovery objective, this is my goal. And when you look at the screenshot, and I mentioned earlier, when you start looking at this screenshot where you got a full database backup running every day and a log backup running every 15 minutes, I'll throw in a question, are these backup schedules enough for you to meet your recovery objectives? I mean, think about it. You might be thinking, well, I've got log backups running every 15 minutes, which means I can recover my database up to the last 15 minutes. Well, case in point, what if your database got corrupted at 11:58 p.m.? You certainly have more than 24, I think about 24 log backups to restore on top of the full database backup. Question is, have you tested restoring your full backups and all your log backups and make sure that you meet your recovery objectives? And these are just two aspects of what it takes to build a disaster recovery solution. The third one, what I call commitment, is a service level agreement. And it should answer the question, what have we agreed upon? You know, what's interesting, every time I come and do consulting engagements for my customers, and they start asking me, so what particular solution are we supposed to implement? The first question I asked was, especially for service companies, so what did you promise your customers? What was it that your customers signed up for? Because if your customers signed up for, let's say, X, we have to deliver them X plus. Well, the plus is, of course, meeting and exceeding the expectation. But the point is, the service level agreement is simply based on what you have agreed upon and what you promised for your customers if you're providing services for your customers, or internally, if, let's say, you've defined a specific SLA for an HR system. Because this will form the foundation, again, of how you would design, architect, and build a solution. I mean, think of it this way. If you're a software as a service provider and you're providing, let's say, an application to your customers, and you've defined that your customers would have a 12-hour window in terms of response time and problem resolution and all of that, you don't want to be over-architecting your solution, because the more complex it becomes, the longer it takes for you to deliver that promise. And so you have to use these three things or four things, your service level agreement, your recovery objectives, and your business impact analysis as the foundation for defining what your goals are in terms of designing disaster recovery solutions for your IT assets. And the reality is, when you start talking about recovery objectives and service level agreements, it costs money. In fact, one of my favorite examples that I use when it comes to disaster recovery and high availability solutions is, think of this as insurance policies or your health insurance. I'm pretty sure that nobody needs health insurance until you need them, and it requires money. And this is a conversation that you will have, because buying an enterprise edition license requires money. Implementing clustering requires money. Implementing a cold or a warm standby requires money. And a way to really define the correlation between recovery objectives and your service level agreements is by looking at this graph. And let me just spend a couple of minutes just talking about this graph, because I'm pretty sure you've heard from the business stakeholders talk to you about, I want zero downtime, I want zero data loss. I want you to take this graph and explain. As you go left on the time axis, the cost increases exponentially. You want zero downtime and zero data loss, you got to be ready to pay for it. And this is where business stakeholders start reevaluating their claims about zero downtime and zero data loss. And by the way, anybody who promises zero downtime and zero data loss is just promising unicorns. The reality is there will always be downtime and there will always be data loss, because we're humans. There's no such thing as a perfect system. But again, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to define reality in terms of expectation and how much it costs. And like I said, take this graph, show it to your manager, your boss, the business stakeholders. Once you start talking about disaster recovery or even high availability solutions, the more you approach zero, the more expensive it becomes. And like I said, no different from insurance policy. You want full coverage, this is how much it will cost you. You want basic coverage, it's a lot cheaper than full coverage. And think of this in terms of the starting point for any discussion when it comes to deciding what high availability and disaster recovery solutions that you would implement for a specific IT asset. Let's take this. Let's bring this full circle. In fact, I mentioned up until now, it's been more than 10 years that I've been answering questions on the MSD and TechNet forums. So when somebody asks questions about what solution am I going to implement, how do I implement failover clustering, and I ask the question, what's your recovery objective, I almost instantly get the same response. So what's a recovery objective? And the reason I say this is because when you have the definition of your recovery objectives and your service level agreements, it becomes the foundation of what specific solution and how you want to implement that solution for a specific IT asset. Because now your decision about what type of hardware are we going to use, what technology are we going to use, who will be our service provider, what licenses are we going to buy, everything should be driven by your recovery objectives and your service level agreement. Now let's be honest, let's be realistic here. As SQL Server professionals, IT professionals, sometimes you do not have any decision at all as how to define our recovery objectives. In fact, if you ask me, I want zero downtime and zero data loss. And it's also not our job to define this for the business, but our responsibility is to properly communicate how the business stakeholders should define these items to meet the business objectives. We need to guide them to properly define what the recovery objectives are and service level agreements are. I mean, I'll take a classic example. I want failover clustering, says one customer. Well, or let's do something like, I want availability groups. It's the hot thing. It's the latest and greatest. Let's do availability groups. First question I ask is, so what's your recovery objective? Well, if they say they can go for 4 hours without, or 4-hour downtime, they can afford that. Well, we all know that Enterprise Edition is required for availability groups as of SQL 2014. But the system can't afford a 4-hour downtime. Wouldn't Standard Edition be enough? And if that's the case, maybe a failover cluster or even database mirroring could qualify as a disaster recovery solution. You might be thinking, why am I still recommending database mirroring when it's already been deprecated? Well, it still solves the problem. It's still supported. It's just been deprecated, but it still is supported, and it's cheaper than Enterprise Edition. The fact still remains, of course, that when you start implementing stuff like availability groups, which is now dependent on Active Directory, do we have the staff? Do we have the skill set in-house in order to support availability groups? Oh, if we're going to outsource this to a service provider, does the service provider have the qualified staff and the skill set to meet a specific recovery objectives? And this is why I always start the conversation about disaster recovery and high availability in terms of these phrases and these items, because, again, they form the foundation of how we need to move forward. And you'll be surprised. Again, you'll be surprised. Disaster recovery is becoming mandatory with all the regulations and audit requirements. And it's an expense if you think about it. If you can drop the cost of implementing a disaster recovery solution while maintaining and meeting business requirements, you'll be surprised at how much you could really accomplish. In 2005, I think it's 2005, Walt Media came up with a movie with Walt Disney called Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I actually use this movie as a reference point for the succeeding items I want to talk about, and I kind of call it the Lion, the Switch, not the Witch, the Switch, and the Wardrobe. In addition to knowing what your business impact is, what your recovery objectives are, and your service level agreements are, you need to tack these items and add them to your disaster recovery solutions. First one, the Lion, which answers the question, who is in charge? Well, there's a lot of people in charge. Even in small IT shops where you happen to be the DBA, the network admin, the Windows admin, the server admin, the network guy, and somebody has to be in charge. In the database world, it's the DBA who takes care of the database. That could be you. That could be your DBAs if you're an IT manager. But somebody who takes care of the database. But of course, your databases or your SQL Server databases particularly still sit on a Windows Server operating system. And the Windows Server operating system sit on a machine, whether it's a physical or a virtual machine. Therefore, you need to know who the server admin is. Not just know. You need to know when they're going on vacation. You need to know the contact number. You need to know their secondary contact information. You need to know their availability and so on and so on. You need to know their backups, if they have backups. You think databases are the only ones that need backups. I claim to be the high availability guy, but I don't want to be highly available. I want to take my vacations. I want some time to relax. And you need to know if, you need to know who's in charge of the server. If it's on a physical machine, you need to know who's responsible for the hardware. You need to know, if it's a virtual machine, you need to know the VM host admin, where your SQL Server instances or your SQL Server databases are running. You need to know the network engineer because, as I mentioned, your application needs to connect to the database, go through the network, and I hope your applications are not sitting on the same machine as your SQL Server instances. But the point is, again, these are components that interact with the database in order for the database to provide, the service across the network, but you need to know who's responsible for the firewall changes that need to be implemented in order to secure and make sure that traffic goes to and from your databases. Oh, and by the way, if you're implementing a disaster recovery solution, the technology that you're going to use will definitely require access to the network. You need to know the supplier, where you bought your hardware from. Well, if it's a Dell PowerEdge server, you need to know who's the supplier. You need to have the contact information. You need to know the contact person. You need to know their SLA. If you make a phone call, if one of the hard drives fail, how long does it take to get a replacement hard drive? If the memory module fails and call your supplier, how long does it take for you to get the replacement? These are some of the things that you need to be aware of because they're going to be a part of your team. The manager, the CIO, the CTO, who needs to make the tough calls. And going back to what I mentioned earlier, I fall into the trap of let's get this done quickly, let's solve this issue quickly. I kind of like fixing database corruption issues, but hey, if my RPO is 2 hours, I am so not going to spend 1 hour and a half trying to recover a database and fixing corruption issues because I might not be able to make my recovery objective. And if somebody is willing to make that call, whether that's your manager, the CIO or CTO that says, hey, stop what we're doing, reevaluate, where are we at our recovery objectives, where are we at our SLAs, how long will it take for us to get that thing recovered? Because at the end of the day, we need to meet those objectives. Those are our goals. And if you ask me, I'll go ahead and just spend all my time trying to fix a problem, trying to find root cause and all that. But again, there's a much bigger goal at stake here. It's the recovery objectives and the service level agreement. The service provider, in days and age of cloud, are you going on Amazon? Are you going on Rackspace? Are you going on Microsoft Cloud? What are their SLAs? Because if you decide to put your stuff on a co-location environment or on the cloud, you better be sure that whatever you promise your customer or whatever it is that you've defined as your SLA is something that your service provider will have to meet. You have to constantly ask the question, who else is included in your pack? It's kind of interesting. Hurricane Sandy a couple of years ago, when that struck the East Coast, Stack Overflow, very famous website, and a lot of the tech companies on the East Coast didn't realize that one of the things that they forgot to be included in their team happens to be the guy driving the fuel truck. Well, they got generators that power up their data centers, but they need to make sure that the fuel truck driver can make it in time to deliver fuel for their generators, keep their generators up and running. So you have to constantly evaluate who else is included in your pack, who else is going to be a part of the Lion's pack. It's not just you, the DBA, because there's going to be a lot of dependencies to make that disaster recovery solution work. The second one is what I call the switch. I call it the switch because it asks the question, what other hardware? And this is kind of interesting for us because when, as IT professionals, we kind of look at our hardware. We kind of think of hardware in terms of, the server hardware, the network hardware, the appliance, when we don't necessarily think about other things that may affect our IT assets. HVAC. I remember when I was, again, a data center engineer almost 10 years ago, we started getting alerts from our monitoring system about CPU spikes on our production servers. CPU has been sustained for about 100% for more than 5 minutes. Couldn't figure it out. No code changes, no index issues, nothing. We couldn't figure it out. Until one of our data center engineers who happened to be in the data center told us a couple of the air conditioning systems broke down. We couldn't figure out what caused the air conditioning to break down, but the thing that we did in order to get the production servers up and running is, number one, we started powering down our UAT and staging servers. Shut down, no question asked. Shut down everything. That lowered down the temperature inside the data center until somebody said, let's bring in industrial fans inside the data center. And all of a sudden, our production servers started operating as normal. And we never think of HVAC system or the air conditioning systems as part of the hardware that we need to take care of. Of course, we don't really care. It's supposed to be the building and data centers' responsibility to take care of heating, ventilation, and air conditioning for our IT assets. But this is included in the other hardware we need to be aware of. Is there enough power supply? Well, demand changes, databases grow, transactions increase, we need to add more servers, we need to add more systems. Question is your power supply enough to make sure that everything that you've added is not going to overload the power source? And again, this is one of those things that we rarely even think about in terms of disaster recovery and even high availability. I mean, come to think of it, yeah, we got backup UPS, we got backup this and backup that. The more you add backup something in your data center, well, I'm pretty sure they're using up electricity, they're using up power, and you're probably not aware of the fact that, as you add more resources, it's going to demand more from your power source. Is your power source capable of handling that workload? It's not just in terms of, yeah, your databases can handle increased workload, but is your power source capable of handling increased workloads in terms of additional appliance, additional servers, additional UPS? The last one is the wardrobe. And I kind of look at it in terms of what other storage, and I don't mean what other storage in terms of, your hard drive, your tapes, and all. No. Think of this as the other storage that you need in order to meet your objectives in terms of disaster recovery solutions. Like runbooks. The dreaded runbook, the dreaded documentation. I bet if I ask everyone in this webinar, how many of you like writing documentation? I'm pretty sure more than half would say, no, I don't like to write documentations. The funny thing is, while some might say I like writing documentations, a few of them would probably say I like updating documentation. But documentation is key. Documentation and runbook is key to making sure that your disaster recovery solutions are not just paper submitted so that you can pass audit requirements and compliance requirements. It is the key to whether or not your disaster recovery strategies would work. Do you even have one? I mean, I would strongly, if you don't have one, start writing documentation, even if it's just small. Put in the basic details. Is it updated? As you put in the details, you will constantly add changes, introduce changes on your system. In fact, there was a blog post that I wrote recently about how change management is key to operational efficiency. Because every change that you introduce in your system, whether it's adding memory, upgrading SQL Server, introducing partitioning, splitting storage, all of that is risk introduced into your system. And as risk gets introduced, so does the potential for other unknown. And so when you keep your documentation updated, every time you add a change, I've installed the service pack, I've installed a cumulative update, you include that in your documentation so that when you have a disaster recovery that needs, hey, I need to rebuild my server from scratch, whether it's a VM or a physical server, you know exactly what's going to get in there because it has been documented. Is it written properly? Now, of course, not everyone is a writer. I still don't consider myself a writer, but my goal every time I write documentation is that if I hand this over to a newly hired engineer or somebody who's fresh out of college who's probably getting their feet wet and learning the ropes and being a database administrator, they should be able to understand what the document is about. And is it readily available? Because if you have a document management system in place and that document management system goes down, well, guess what? Well, I can't access my documentation. Doesn't matter if it's updated, written properly, but if it's not readily available, well, how do you follow procedures if you don't have access to procedures that you need to follow? The second one is backups. Understand, of course, that there might be database-specific backups, and there might be enterprise-wide backups. Know where those are stored. If you're using third-party backups, make sure that you've tested those backups. Make sure that you know how long it takes to backup and restore. Because those backups, when restored, need to meet your recovery objectives. You need to know where they are stored, and if you do have access, because if you are working for a large IT organization and you have an enterprise backup team responsible for all of the backups, well, if you have to request for permission to grab those backups, how long does it take for the approval for the signature to be made available in order for you to restore the backups? And are they properly labeled? There's a reason why your SQL Server agent job backups or the database maintenance plan backups have file names that include the date and time when the backups were generated because, well, we're human. SQL Server doesn't really care because SQL Server reads the log sequence numbers. But I probably won't be spending time reading log sequence backups to find out what the latest backup is. I just need to grab, okay, open Windows Explorer, sort by last updated date and time, and I'll grab the one that's the latest backup. With proper labeling, it's going to be easier for me to find out where the latest backup is, grab that, and restore. Of course, I already mentioned that earlier. I don't care if it's a successful backup. My goal is to make sure that backups can be restored successfully, and that's the only time that I can guarantee that the backups are working fine. And then installation media. What types of installation media? Well, you got your correct SQL Server version. And when I mean SQL Server version, I don't just mean SQL Server 2014 SP1 64-bit. Well, what if you installed cumulative updates after that? And that's where your documentation would come in really handy. Because if you know exactly what SQL Server version you're running, SQL Server 2014, cumulative update X, you know that when you provision a VM, for example, for disaster recovery, that's exactly what you're going to need. You don't want to have a version of SQL Server that's higher because it will upgrade the version of your databases. You also don't want your database version or SQL Server version to be lower because you won't be able to restore the backups from, or you will be, but yes. But the point is you have to have the correct SQL Server version, the edition, and whether it's 32 or 64-bit. I sure hope nobody's still using 32-bit. You got to have the right drivers. Is your SQL Server interacting with third-party or other data platforms, like you got link servers with Oracle, or you got connectivity to a Cloudera, Hadoop infrastructure? You got to have the right drivers for that, because you don't want to end up with installing the drivers that you thought would work, but then when you run your jobs, they don't. And of course, firmware. Whether they're the drivers that you need for the storage, or whether you need the drivers or firmware that you need for VMware, you got to have that installed and available as well. Finally, you. There's a reason why you've attended this webinar. There's a reason why you're here and learning, because you want to learn more about what you need to do in case a real disaster occurs. Share your knowledge, come up with knowledge transfer sessions, internal training, brown bag sessions. If you're the only DBA, share that to other people in your IT team. It really doesn't matter, because the more somebody knows about what you know, the better it is that you have a team that can back you up in case you need to go on vacation. In summary, I've talked about everything that has nothing to do with technology in terms of disaster recovery, because again, my goal is always to start the conversation about disaster recovery by not talking about technology, but rather starting off with the business requirements and making sure that every decision will meet those business requirements, whether it's a technical decision or otherwise. They have to meet those business requirements. Let me open up the next couple of minutes for answering questions. If you do have questions, please take a minute to type those questions in the chat window.
Thank you, Edwin. We already have one. Please put them in the questions window, not the chat window. We have one sympathetic attendee, Chris Bankovic, who says our HVAC went down for hours and took our server room down, got over 108 degrees. So there's somebody to back you up on that.
Wow. Again, if you do have questions, feel free to type those in the question, not the chat window, by the way, on the question window.
Yeah, I have it open, and everybody's probably blitzed because they're not used to getting sermons and not technology. They should come to my performance course. And they get sermons.
Again, it's really interesting when I talk to my customers about this, because again, my goal is to meet business objectives, because at the end of the day, technology is useless if not to meet business requirements.
Okay, RPO, RTO also depends on the sizes. Oh, I've lost my audio. I'm going to have, okay, it says I've got my audio is back. So let me get to the top of my question list. RPO, RTO also depends on the sizes of databases. The larger database could make cold restores take much longer. And Diane says, this is excellent, having lived through many of the same scenarios. Rob says, should your DR strategy allow for different types of RTO, RPO based on different types of disaster?
These are actually great questions, really wonderful questions, like RPO and RTO and SLA. just because you have a predefined RPO and RPO and SLA doesn't mean that you have to keep all your backup strategies the same from the beginning to the end. No, you constantly have to reevaluate that, because the larger your database, the longer it takes for you to restore them. And of course, the longer it takes for you to restore them, the more you have to reevaluate what approach that you're going to take. Are you going to do split or I forgot, you stripe rather your backups across different storage? Are you going to be using backup compression? Are you going to be using third party? These are things that we have to constantly reevaluate, but keep in mind the reason why we are reevaluating these solutions is because we have a recovery objective or a business requirement that we need to meet.
What percentage of companies do you think are really prepared for a disaster?
I don't want to be so here's
He's not going to commit himself.
it's interesting.
Mike observes where you need to know where are the backups, like Commvault or other backup solution. Sheldon's asking, how often do you recommend that we do a test restoration to test our backups?
Great question. That really depends on what your objectives are. When I was a data center engineer, we were doing it quarterly, primarily because that is mandatory, because we're supporting a financial platform. In fact, we only have one customer. It's one of the largest insurance companies in North America, and we did that every 4 months or every 3 months, and we look at the document, we look at our DR process, we reevaluate, and then we do it again. It's a practice. You think of disaster recovery as your firefighters and your soldiers. They're training, they're making sure that everything that they planned for works, and hopefully they're not going to ever have to do it.
Barbara says, if the business has never defined SLAs, do you have any advice for helping them do so?
One of the reasons why every time I speak at the PASS Summit, I don't talk about technology. I talk about professional development like communication and presentation skills, because our job as database administrators or IT professionals is not to define recovery objectives and service level agreements. The business has to define that because they know what the risks are. But if they don't have one, it's our job to properly communicate and help them and guide them so that they could define what those are. You might want to spin up a conversation about, do we have audit requirements? Do we have compliance? And this is where they start thinking about it, because we're not talking to the business stakeholders in terms of clustering and mirroring and we're talking to them in their own language. Like, for example, if a company is going public, what are the different requirements for a company going public? Now, I know this is totally outside of the scope of DBA, but this is us guiding the business stakeholders to properly define what those business requirements are in order to get them on paper, practiced, tested, and verified, so that by the time that the company is about to go public, prices. And again, this is language that the business stakeholders understand. They know about the dollars, the revenue, the risks, not bits and bytes and corruption and all that.
Eric observes, and I think it's a good point, also just ensure that all the employees need to know where to go if they don't have access to the building, for example, in the case of a fire.
That is a wonderful insight. In fact, part of what we include in our disaster recovery exercise is business continuity plan. Part of it is, hey, I can't access the building because of a calamity. How do we respond to that? And that should be included in a disaster recovery strategy as well.
Yeah, my ex-husband worked for a bank, and he had to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and get on a plane to Pittsburgh because the scenario was there had been a fire in the office in Philadelphia. And he actually got on the plane as part of this drill.
Again, the goal is to make sure that we're ready when it happens, but hoping it doesn't happen.
Okay, I think in answer to an earlier question, I answered this one, but I'll read it out anyway. How do you propose to ensure that a backup can be recovered? Schedule an automatic restore every week or so to another server?
In the days of the cloud and virtualization, this is no longer a challenge because you could spin up a VM, restore the backups on a VM on an automated process. Could be Hyper-V, VMware, whatever type of virtualization platform that you want. Even on the cloud, you can do that. Of course, that depends on whether or not you have compliance requirements about keeping your data on-premise. But do an automated process of testing it, so that you don't have to worry about it later on. But of course, part of that is also evaluation. When I did the automated process of restoring my backups, did it meet the recovery objectives? Of course, there are limitations as to, hey, I don't have enough storage, or I don't have enough resources for my memory and CPU, but it's taking longer. But you could extrapolate on the values, just making sure that it does meet the recovery objectives overall.
This question could take you from now till 6 o'clock. Do you find it better to start moving away from clustered SAN shared drives and using local always on, and thoughts on Windows clustering in general and its direction?
I love that question. I love to answer that question with a technical response.
I
But
will send
unfortunately,
you the questions log, by the way, Edwin, so if some of these are going to
sure,
take you all night, you can respond to them by email.
absolutely. And going back to that question about should we move to availability groups with local storage, I would probably ask you what your service level agreements and what your recovery objectives are for doing that.
Okay, Michael's saying, my biggest issue is communication. I completely agree with you. They set up SLAs and fail to inform their DBAs. We have to initiate communication and make sure that we are all on the same page. And I think he's echoing something you have said several times.
I love the comment. And like I said, I recently wrote a blog post about change management. I hated change management. I feel like it was a punishment for highly effective and highly efficient DBAs like myself until somebody explained to me what change management is for. Of course, one thing that I didn't do back then was to ask why. And so just asking the questions, why is it necessary, and then communicating that. Now, it might come from us. We might be the one responsible for initiating it. And again, one of the reasons I like high availability and disaster recovery, because it's really never about technology. It's about people in the process. And when you focus on the people in the process, you realize, hey, we need to improve our communications process to improve our operational efficiency, to make sure that we meet our disaster recovery requirements.
And Mike has a final observation. Include in the Lions some testers. Ensure that the recovered system works prior to going live by DR test simulation.
I will definitely include that. In fact, I did include a lot of things when I was working again as a data center engineer. There's a couple of different things that we included as part of our alliance, not just the network guys. We included the business stakeholders, which means who am I supposed to be calling once we've managed to restore the system, because the business stakeholders will make the decision, and the testers will then perform whatever it is that they need to do. But again, I didn't include that because it's going to be taking longer. But again, really appreciate that comment.
Well, thank you very much, Edwin. If you will send me your PowerPoint, I will post that along with the recording. And I thank you all for coming. And we'll have another meeting January 27th at noon Eastern, and the title of the presentation is SQL Server Defaults Suck. I am reluctant to say that on the public screen, but that's the title. So see you in a couple of weeks, and thank you all very much for coming. And thank you, Edwin.
Thanks, everyone.